Welcome to Rising Woman Leaders. I'm your host, Meredith Rahm, and I believe the time has come for women to share their gifts, their voice, and their stories. I love seeing women spiritually and financially empowered, thriving in their life's work, and doing what they love every day. I've gathered a community of women living their dreams to tell us their stories and inspire us to step into more courage, self-love, and feminine leadership. If you like this podcast, use the hashtag Rising Woman Leaders, follow me on Instagram at Meredith Rahm, and sign up for email updates at risingwomanleaders.com to get all the new and inspiring content. Now get cozy with a journal and a cup of tea. I hope you enjoy today's show. I'm here today with Michelle Johnson. She has a deep understanding of how trauma impacts the mind, body, and spirit, and the heart. Her awareness of the world through her experience as a Black woman allows her to know firsthand how privilege and power operate. She understands the toll that oppression can take on individuals and the collective, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. She is a social justice warrior, empath, yoga teacher, and practitioner, and an intuitive healer. Whether in an anti-oppression training, yoga space, individual or group intuitive healing session, healing and wholeness are at the center of how she approaches all of her work in the world. She has a background as a licensed clinical social worker and has been teaching yoga for 10 years. She began her own teacher training in 2014 and recently wrote a book about yoga and justice called Skill in Action, Radicalizing Your Yoga Practice to Create a Just World. Thank you for being here, Michelle.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, I was lucky to get to read a little piece of your book, and I just want to say thank you for writing it, and for sharing your story in it, and for just doing this work and following the call of your heart. It's very powerful.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I would just want to start with a little bit about your story. And I know something you shared about growing up is just this feeling of not totally fitting in, not fully feeling like you could be in the community with the Black people. I wasn't Black enough. And then the communities with the white people, I'm not white. That sense of just what it was like for you growing up. I'd love to hear a little more.
Yeah, I think part of that awareness of being a racialized being, and also an awareness of being in a racialized world and culture, happened at a very young age. And I think what intersected with that is I remember being a child and standing in my driveway and being like, when is the spaceship coming to get me? Because something has gone awry on this planet. Like from a very young age, being like, where are the people? Like, can they come take me away from this place? And I add that to the racialized culture and myself as a racialized being, because I think I understood that there was an imbalance of power from what I witnessed almost as soon as I could form words or speak or talk or communicate. I grew up with my mother and my brother. My brother's biracial and he's adopted. He's Black and white and 4 years older than me. So he was part of the family before I came into the world in this physical form. And my mother sent us to private school. She was a public school teacher, but she sent us to private school. She got us scholarships to go. And I was in school with all white children, except for in each grade, there was a Black girl and a Black boy. I was the Black girl in my grade. There was a Black boy. His name was John. And I don't remember other people of color being there. And so while I was different racially than the folks in the class that I went to school with, I was also socioeconomically different because I didn't have a lot of money growing up. And I went to school with a lot of children who were white and had access to money or had a lot of money. And that was the landscape at school. And so most of my friends were white because that's where I went I was at school most of the time. But then my mother sent me to ballet at a community center with almost all Black girls. And I remember having a moment where I was like, oh, I'm not exactly like these young girls I'm in ballet class with. And they look like me, but they tell me that I talk white and I dress white. And I don't look like them, and I had trouble connecting with them. And then I was very clear in school that I wasn't like the kids I went to school with either. And so it was this awareness that there was imbalance in power and that my skin color meant something. And what I internalized is growing up that it was different, I was different, that was something that wasn't valued, my skin color. But I was sort of between worlds of like, well, these girls, young Black girls, because of what they've taken in from culture, are telling me I don't fit in with them. And then the white kids, just by virtue of their race, and I would go to their homes and people in their homes worked and looked just like me and my grandmother. And I was like, I don't fit here either. And so it was just a confusing childhood for sure around race. And we didn't really talk about race in my house, even though my brother was biracial and adopted. My mom's Black. My parents divorced when I was 2. My father's Black, and he remarried a white woman. And so race was showing up all over the place. We just never talked about it. And so I didn't really understand or have a language for how racism operates until I was about 21, 22. I went to a course on dismantling racism, and I remember having a moment of sort of deep liberation from having language and an analysis about what I'd experienced my whole life.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit more of how you felt that calling to step into this as your work as well.
Well, in that training, so I was sent to that training because I was on the board of directors for this organization that's called North Carolina Lambda Youth Network. They were located in Durham, North Carolina. That was a youth-led LGBTQ organization. I joined their board, and they sent us to this dismantling racism training in South Carolina on what was an old plantation. And so I remember going there and energetically feeling the space that I was in. It was a mixed group. It was like 50% people of color, 50% white folks in this space, about 40 of us, maybe a few more, maybe 45. And my trainers, Tema and Bree, did a phenomenal job of explaining how racism operates and then what we internalize as racialized beings. And I just remember feeling like an awakening that it's something I couldn't turn away from once I had the language and analysis and understanding, and it resonated so deeply with me. I couldn't forget what I'd learned. And so much so that I got a tattoo that means revelation on my wrist right after that training, because I was like, oh, my whole world is different now. And I don't want to forget. Like, I want to remember this. And that experience of being cracked open and also liberated through language and analysis and affirmation. Like, it's not just me. Racism is real. Like, this is not just me. People study this. They talk about it. They train about it. Other folks of color are talking to me about it, and that they were talking to me about it in that setting. We did affinity groups in that setting as people of color and white folks. And so that just drew me in. And I felt like I already knew I was a teacher and educator and could inspire and move people. I understood that. And I just felt called to do more of the work around educating folks about how racism shows up and operates. And also over time that shifted to I want to create more healing spaces for people of color.
Mm-hmm. It's what I'm hearing is that having this element of transparency of like, okay, we can sit down and talk about this, and something that I've been internalizing my whole life, couldn't talk to anyone about. Suddenly there's a language for it. There's other people recognizing this is going on. We can talk about it. It doesn't need to be under the surface anymore. That sounds like it was really liberating, part of the healing journey.
Yeah. It definitely was and is. And I talk about it in training all the time now. I invite groups to remember. And I also invite groups to, over time, I feel like I've sort of learned that more of what I do is related to like grief and holding space for people to acknowledge the truth and then to be with that. And usually there's some loss connected or associated with that. And so I was talking to a colleague last night about that. I just said, I wish we could we were training some folks, right, offering curriculum and content. And I said, I wish we could just sit here and talk about Black and brown bodies that have been murdered or annihilated since we last met. We've met 3 weeks prior with this group. I wish we could just sit and do that and light candles and just breathe and be with it instead of talking about it or adding more content. And so part of the healing for me is really about making space to truth tell and to surface multiple truths and counter stories to what dominant culture has told me and tells people, and how it conditions us. And to make space for people to grieve the losses that all of us experience because of how white supremacy operates in the culture.
Yeah. And this I see is, it's an interesting, a little bit different than how I've seen a lot of activists approach social justice, bringing in that element of the yoga. You're a yoga teacher, bringing in the element of the feeling. Probably these sharing circles where people can drop into their heart and really share what's real. Could you speak a little more to your approach and bringing yoga in and how you see that as different or just a new way of looking at it from maybe what other people are doing or what you've seen being done?
I want to say that I feel like there's a role for everyone in activist work and social justice spaces or in spaces where we're trying to create justice. And what I have experienced and witnessed in some spaces, some social justice circles, some activist circles and spaces, is that sometimes we replicate the very systems that we're fighting against through the tactics and through the tools and through the righteousness about I know, I've arrived, you don't know. Depending on what your role is in creating justice, it can be sort of de-energizing. It can take a lot of energy without filling back up. And I feel like it's really challenging to sustain a practice of creating justice without some contemplative practice or mindfulness practice. And I also recognize that's a very different way of thinking about doing activist work. So I was a social worker and activist before I became a yoga teacher. And although I feel like I practiced mindfulness and that the breath was deeply liberating for me before I ever spoke those words out loud in a yoga training and in a yoga class. And the activist lens that I brought into teacher training allowed me to question how yoga was being taught and to question the departure of yoga's roots from justice in the way that it's taught in the West or in this country. And how I pair yoga and mindfulness practice with activism is that I just believe we have to be embodied as we're doing the work. And I've witnessed a lot of folks who are activists not be connected to their bodies at all and not be able to connect with their hearts, but to be willing to die for the cause in this disembodied way, which it just feels very confusing for me to witness that, although I understand where it comes from. It's just how culture is constructed and then how we respond to that and the tools that we have available to us. And also there's a hierarchy in social justice circles too about, are you enough of an activist, right? And an activist means going to the rally and, or sometimes an activist means being an anarchist, right? And I just think yes, and we're not going to sustain the practice of creating justice, and we're not going to be able to be intentional about the tools that we use to create justice or our ways of being without practicing mindfulness, whatever that means for people. And so what it looks like in a space for me, a training, or if I'm holding space, it could be a yoga training or a training where I'm leading an anti-racist workshop, we always start with the breath. And what I say about the breath is that the breath is life-giving in a culture that wants many of us to not be able to breathe, and that oppression takes the breath away. And we have such good examples of how that's happened, when that's happened, and to whom. And we start with the breath, and we move from there and create a space where people call in their ancestors so they can ground in that way, which is different in my mind than a lot of the spaces that I've been in where we're talking about activism. I think it's important to remember where we came from, and like, we are not the first people doing this work. Many people have done this work and died doing the work, whether that's physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual death that's happened. And then throughout a training, or if I'm holding space, we come back to the breath, we come back to embodiment. We, in an anti-racism training, sometimes we move through defining racism in an embodied way. So people take on different shapes with the words that make up the definition of racism. In the training that I led last night, which was a follow-up to a Dismantling Racism training, we started with the heart. And I asked people to connect with their heartache, heartbreak, or heart opening that had happened since we last met related to white supremacy and racism. And we also usually talk about the self system. So individually, I have a system. And we talk about what we're taking in from culture and the air that we breathe, and how does that impact our system. And we talk about that in an anti-racist context. As people of color, how does that affect the system? As white folks, what happens as a result of taking in messages? And then what manifests in response to that? So those are some tools that I use in training spaces that are really about allowing people to connect with the truth and their bodies and their hearts, so that they can really be intentional about the changes that they make in the world, and so that they can vision like really clearly about the world in which they want to live.
I love bringing the embodiment in, and it feels like just different layers are being uncovered and unveiled. And also I sense a real space of safety being created in this space with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recently I led a training, and I started with the breath. And in this particular training, we had mostly white folks. It was through my job here in Portland, and some folks of color there. And I started with the breath and said, oppression takes the breath away. And at a break, a Black man came up to me, and he said, at first, when I said that, he just stopped breathing, right? Because of how jarring it can be to really be in the truth of what oppression can do. Mm-hmm. And then when he kept practicing the breath, like, he was able to deepen his breath. And what was happening, he said, for him, which felt really powerful, is that he recognized that he holds his breath in many spaces. And so to be invited by a Black woman to breathe was like transformative. And to be in a space with white folks where I was leading this breath practice and work was transformative for him to have even if it was like 2 minutes, he had space to breathe. And so there was like a moment of safety in a very unsafe world for him and for many of us. And it just struck me how profound. It sounds so simple to invite people to breathe, and it's so profound to invite people into a space where they can breathe freely in a world where many of us are not afforded that privilege or opportunity or gift.
Yeah. Because so much of this, and I read this in your book about just like having your breath taken away, all of these experiences and moments and challenges, and it really does. So what an invitation to begin every training in this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's powerful.
So I wanted to break things down a little bit for anyone that's listening that like this might be totally new for them. Or could you just share your definitions of privilege and oppression, and just just like breaking things down in a way for anyone that this is like new, what you would describe it as.
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked me to share my definitions of words and terms, because language is really powerful. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have a shared language and we're trying to strategize around an issue, or we're trying to come up with a strategy that will create justice, but we have really different understandings of what words mean, then I think it's hard to create a strategy for the collective, and it's hard to be on the same page. And so I'm glad that you're asking about words, because when I think about, I'll talk about racism and privilege and white supremacy and oppression. I think those would be helpful to name, because they're words that get used, and over time, like culture has used them in really different ways. Like when I was growing up when I was young, I didn't hear white supremacy on the TV at all. And now I hear it or read it. So it shows me there's some cultural shift and norming around that language. Still lots of confusion about it. So I was conditioned to think about racism as just personal, and about me not getting along with someone who is different than me. So has different skin color than I do. And that if we could just get along and tolerate one another, then racism would stop. Like, I was conditioned to think it's just personal, it's not a system. And what was so liberating about the training that I went to, the first Dismantling Racism training, is they talked about racism as a system. And the definition that we use, and many people use who are doing anti-racism work, it's from critical race theory, is that racism is race prejudice. So I have prejudices and biases that I embody, and some of them I'm aware of, some I'm not actually aware of at all, or unconscious. But racism is race prejudice plus social power and institutional power. And so when I'm thinking about institutions, I'm thinking about who has access to decision-making, decision makers, who can make the decisions, who has access to resources, time, money, information, and then social norms and institutions around policy and practice and just ways of being. So that racism is race prejudice backed up by social and institutional power. And historically, people of color have not held social and institutional power because of how the culture has been constructed, and because of the how race has been constructed and changed over time. So, for example, not all white people became white at the same time is one way to think about that. And then that racism is this system, and you mentioned privilege, is the system of advantage based on race. And this is where privilege comes in. So that people are, and if we're talking about the system of race, that white people are advantaged just for being white. Whether they don't have to earn that white skin is valued, that there's currency attached to it, that whiteness, and that, so when I say whiteness, I'm not talking about individual white people, I'm talking about a system again. So that whiteness controls the norms and narratives, and who gets to tell the stories and narratives, and the belief systems that are seen as good or moral or right. And so that racism is the system of advantage based on race, so that a group is being privileged just for being part of that group, and another group, people of color, is being oppressed or pushed down. And that's just how it's been constructed. So as I go into these definitions, it's not about white people being bad and people of color being good. That's so limiting, and that's not the conversation I'm interested in having. It's like learning this definition and then thinking about how it's true for people. Because I will say, as a woman of color, I have internalized racism and white supremacy, and there are ways that I collude with the system. So I go along to get along. Or there are ways that I've dissociated from other people of color to move up in an institution. And racism is this system of oppression based on race. That's the one group's being lifted up, another group being pushed down. And then the last part of this definition of racism is that it's a white supremacy system. It's designed to build and maintain white supremacy. typically people have reactions in their bodies and their hearts, their minds when they hear the term, when they hear white supremacy. And I use it a lot because it feels like it is what's true. And it's liberating to use words that define a truth that is happening in a space, in a culture that doesn't want us to use those words. Because I think that people have been conditioned to think that one of the worst things you can be called is a racist. And that people, when they think of white supremacy, think of white supremacists, not a system, not a belief system, not an ideology. And so I think about white supremacy as a belief system, as an ideology. Certainly some individuals are white supremacist. But if I just focus on them, then I'm not focusing on the larger system and how it behaves and how it treats white people and how it treats people of color. And if I don't see it as a system, it's hard to understand how it's causing harm to all of us, white people and people of color. And so I don't use that language or term as a weapon. It's more like just a truth. So then we can do something about it. Yeah. Right? Like we can name it, see it, struggle with it, question it, and do something about it.
Yeah.
So those are that's sort of the full definition of racism with the other words weaved in there.
Yes. Thank you for those definitions.
Yeah.
So one question I have is, I know that having these conversations, starting to bring this to the forefront, it can be uncomfortable, it can be emotional, it can bring up fear. I wanted to hear your input around how to approach beginning to have these conversations and, having that space, coming with compassion for ourselves and for others, and what your experience with that has been like.
Yes, discomfort is part of the process. Mm-hmm. And this is where yoga and justice fit. In my mind, they're the same. Like, because discomfort's part of that practice, witnessing it, and figuring out how we want to relate to it. And the same is true of discomfort in a anti-racism process or a discussion about how racism is happening, or a discussion about accounting for what has happened or history. So in every training or space where we're going to talk about oppression, this is another reason that I start with the breath, but I usually talk about discomfort, and I talk about how transformation happens. Like, I feel like transformation can happen from ease and joy. And I also think more of my experiences with transformation have come from a space of dissonance, cognitively, or emotionally, where something feels misaligned. And the reason it's misaligned is so that I can get to the next truth or space or level or plateau in my understanding. That's how I think about it. And so I think people are afraid to talk about oppression because they're afraid of being implicated in the system. And again, I think it goes back to the worst thing that people feel like they can be called as a racist or an oppressor. If we broaden the way that oppression happens, it's not just racism that happens, even though that's most of the work that I do and talk about. And I try to just normalize that discomfort's part of it, and that one of the reasons that oppression thrives is because of fear. And so that we can be with our fear, like we can see, I'm afraid all of the time as a Black woman in the culture, like all of the time, moving in space. And I have to learn how to be with that, live with that, not let that define every move that I make. And I use myself as an example in spaces. So I share that what I just shared with you with groups. And I just normalize that discomfort and fear have a role, and they're part of the process. So they're going to show up. And then what I offer is that we need to practice staying engaged. Like, that is what yoga has taught me. There's discomfort, and how do I stay with it in a culture that wants me to run away from it, to avoid it, to numb out, to distract. And I have so many distractions, right? It's like in some ways easy to numb out from the discomfort for a moment, depending on what we're talking about. And so I just really want people to understand that it's just part of growing. Like it's just part of what's going to be present as we try to figure out a different way of being individually and collectively. And that they have their breath, which is their greatest resource, and that will help them stay engaged. And that there's a lot at stake, because if people don't stay engaged, and really all of us, even though people of color have different work to do, I think, if we're talking about racism, but if people don't stay engaged, people are going to continue to die. That's like how I think about it. That's how high the stakes are for me. So that I want everyone to stay engaged in what is happening so that they can figure out how they want to respond to it. Because of how privilege operates, and I have privileges too, I am able-bodied, and that allows me to not think about the experience of living with a disability, right? Yeah. Because I'm not living with it all the time. So I can just be like, oh, I'm not going to think about it. And typically it takes someone pointing it out to me. Right. And so that's just how privilege operates. And that's this easy out. And we just don't have time to do that anymore. And people's lives depend upon us, we have to stay engaged. So that's some of how I talk about discomfort coupled with resources in response to that, and the tool, the practice of staying engaged.
Yes. Yeah. And I pulled a quote that I wanted to talk more about, which I think relates to what you just said about when we have privilege, there can be this kind of veil of not seeing what is happening. And yet what's really being asked of us now is that everyone start waking up to this, and not just the people who are being oppressed to be rising up and speaking out. So this was the quote I pulled, the Martin Niemöller, I think it's that. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I'm not a socialist. And they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I am not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was not one left to speak for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I wondered if you could speak more of that.
Yeah, that gave me chills hearing it out loud. I've been looking at it on paper, right, in the book, and not saying it out loud, so it gave me chills to hear it. It also made sadness arise, too. Mm-hmm. I think because of what I said about how high the stakes feel. Mm. And really that quote for me speaks to our the collective good, and that there is a collective, and our own humanity and shared humanity. And that if we continue to disengage because we're overwhelmed, or it's too hard to look at or hear, or because we're uncomfortable, then all of us will perish or die in some way. Like some part of us dies as other people are dying. That's what I believe, because we're connected in that way. And that we have to figure out what our role is going to be, and what our responsibility is going to be to the collective good, and what accountability looks like. That's kind of what that quote makes me think about. So that if we continue to disengage, and if we're not responsible, again, if we're overwhelmed, then there's not an awareness that the system of oppression is coming for us too, even though we feel it indirectly, right? Like a lot of what I write about in the book is about race. And so I'll just speak about it that way. So if, and I noticed this after the election. What I noticed is all of a sudden, white folks, some white people woke up, some were already awake, some are still asleep. But white folks woke up, and because they felt deeply impacted by what was happening, And I had to be really clear about humanity and staying engaged, because I wanted to say, this has been happening forever. Like, you just realized this. And so I feel like that quote is about, they're coming for you too. Like, whether you can see it or not, this system of oppression is coming for all of us. It's coming after us. It's taking our spirit, our soul. It's harming us. It's making us disconnect. It's making us dissociate. It's making us distance from each other. Like, and we have to recognize that to make some change. That's what that quote makes me think about. Mm-hmm. It's not just, racism's not just impacting people of color. The system of oppression isn't just harming people of color. It's harming all of us, because we're connected. We're just not conditioned to see that connection. And that's another link to how yoga, I feel like, aligns with justice, because it does talk about us being one, coming from the same place, even though that's not our lived experience in the world, right? Our lived experiences don't mirror that belief, but they could. That's my hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love to hear more about skill and action and things that we can actually do, ways of being we can actually begin to embody. Maybe things from your book, or maybe just ideas you want to share right now. I would love to hear some of these steps that we can take.
Yeah, so the book is, there's a section that's about my story. I tell my story, or part of it. There's a section about what is skill and action, and then what it's not. There's a section that's about, it's relevant to anyone. Some of it is some parts are specific to yoga practitioners or people who are holding spaces for other people. I mean, it could be broadened to that. And at the end of each section, there's a practice. There's some meditations in the book that are more about deepening your self-awareness and about personal development and growth. And then some are about, like, what does justice feel like in the body, so that and alignment feel like, so that we can understand when we're misaligned off of the cushion or off of the mat. We can feel that and then adjust and reconnect to our highest intention or our integrity or highest good, the things that we value and the way that we want to be in the world. There's a practice in there about what you know for sure. It's from Dorothy Allison and her poem about what I know for sure, and it's about what I know for sure about justice and yoga, and that's at the end of the book. At the beginning, there's a practice about where I'm from, and it really invites people into a deep dive around where did you come from. And so I would suggest all of those practices, because some are journaling, some are you practice a meditation, some are about the way that you view the world and shifting your perspective. And then, some other things that people can do. There are many, many trainings on oppression and how it operates. So if people want to understand more about what I said around the definition of racism and the way that I talked about white supremacy or oppression, there are many anti-oppression trainings, I feel like, almost all over the place now, that people can access and go to a physical space and learn, or a webinar, or online, or reading something. There's also this skill that I feel like is not talked about a lot, which is listening. What I know from my own experience is that, and from being in my Black body, is that I've had to prove that racism was happening. Mm. And the way that has looked is naming it in a meeting, right, or workplace, or with a friend, saying, this is what's happening. And sometimes how people respond to that by, prove it to me. It's not a truth that aligns with my truth, so it must not be true. It feels inaccurate. Give me the data, give me the facts, right? Even though there's data around us, like if we look at history and if we look at what's happening, if we look at the news right now, or go to Facebook or any social media or Twitter, we'll know that we have the facts, we have the data. And so listening is really important. And I mean listening to a counter story, listening to a story that has not been told, and just accepting it as true. instead of challenging it because it doesn't feel good, it doesn't fit with what you believe or what you were taught, it means you might have to change, right? So it's like, how can people listen in an undefended way, which is not an easy skill. Like, it's something that I practice all of the time. But I think that's something that it sounds simple again, but it's deeply profound, and it's a practice. And we have to be in our bodies and intentional to be able to show up in an undefended way. And I think we have to be able to see our humanity and the humanity in others to show up in an undefended way. And when we're defensive, we have to know how to respond and correct that and repair. And so listening is a skill that people can practice. I do think a practice of mindfulness is something that people can engage in, whether that's meditating, whether that's moving through a physical practice of yoga, whether that is being in community with people and talking about the things that we're talking about today, but doing that in a mindful way, because mindfulness does help us, as I mentioned earlier, connect with our highest intention and the way that we want to be, like our aspirations. So I think we can be mindful in so many ways. It doesn't just have to be when we go to the yoga mat or the cushion. It can be in anything that we're doing. It can be in an interaction, conversation, the way that we take in information and how we respond. So a mindfulness practice. So there's the practices in the book, there's listening, there are workshops that people can go to, and then some contemplative practice where there's self-reflection and just questioning. I think questioning is a really good practice too. And not believing everything that we think that we see around us, like understanding that there are different perspectives.
Thank you for those. And I agree that the listening is a really powerful one, and letting go of defenses, and that being a practice of needing to be in our embodiment and be able to be connected to our hearts and our breath in order to do that. So I think bringing them together, all of that, really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wanted to share another quote that I felt pulled out from your book and ask a question with that. But one must be connected with their breath to feel their body. A connection to the body allows one to feel their heart. A connection with the heart allows one to become clear about their values so that they may connect with their humanity. When one sees their own humanity and realizes that others are suffering around them, they have the opportunity to connect with the oneness of all beings and our shared humanity. From the breath, body, heart, and awareness of humanity, one must take action. No one can exist without taking action. Skill and action. I thought that was very beautiful, how it was worded. I wanted to share that, your words. And my question, and I wanted to just ask, because I know there is a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, and I wanted to ask about what personally helps you stay connected to hope and your own personal motivations with that.
That's a really good question, and it comes up a lot in the work and in my life. And to answer that, I'm going to just say that maybe it was about 4 years ago, maybe almost 5 years ago. So when George Zimmerman, who had murdered Trayvon Martin, when George Zimmerman was acquitted, I had been out to dinner. I think you may have seen this in the book. I'd been out to dinner, and I came back home, and I read the news, I think on Facebook or something. And then I fell to my knees on the floor, and I cracked open and thought, this is it. Like, this is, I just thought we're going to die. I think that was what I thought. I wasn't having a panic attack. I was having a breakdown, and it felt like all of the ancestral trauma came up and out. And I could not be consoled. Like I felt like I was in whole life, and I'd been doing anti-racism work. There was something about that moment. And I remember after that, then other brown and Black bodies who were being murdered and not valued. And I remember when Sandra Bland was murdered. And in that moment, it was another moment of cracking open, because I felt like that could have been me. Even though before I'd been doing anti-racism work, knew it could have been me, but there was something about feeling more like a target in culture, such that I would have an anxiety attack, like when I saw a police car, right? Which was not something I'd felt in that way before. So I was in a pretty hopeless place. I was experiencing PTSD. I was anticipating the next trauma in the cultural context. And it was very hard to connect to hope. And I was continuing to train people about racism in the midst of feeling completely afraid and hopeless. Mm-hmm. And I had a moment where I was writing on a flip chart. I was writing the definition of racism, and I thought, I'm writing about racism on a flip chart, and people are dying. What am I doing? And it was a moment again where I was like, well, I'm going to question everything that I'm doing in this moment. I'm going to question the work. I'm going to question the way that we're doing it, because felt like there was a disconnect. And what helped me reconnect to hope is that time helped me, space helped me, being in spaces with people of color helped me. Affirmation around that helped support me, meaning like, you're not crazy. This is actually happening, right? Affirming the truth in what I was experiencing. And the other thing that helped me connect to hope is my grandmother. Her name is Dorothy. She passed away in November of 2017, so pretty recently. And she was 96 when she passed away. And I have had so many times where I've thought about her and her resiliency and capacity to survive. Because at 96, she's seen so many things that I haven't seen. So yes, I had a moment of cracking open on the floor where all the ancestral trauma came up and out. And I thought, how many of these moments has my grandmother had? And she's kept moving. She kept walking. She kept showing up. She was deeply devotional and went to church. She kept going to church. She had faith, right? And so I think she has been an anchor for me around what it means to connect to hope. And if I stay in hopelessness, then I will not be able to survive. So I can see the hopelessness, I can feel it, and I have to find, this is just me, I have to find hope. Because, for every violent thing that is happening in the world, people are standing up in response to it. And while it's urgent and I want it to have happened like yesterday, can this stop right now? People are continuing to rise up and use their voices and their bodies and their hearts and trying to create some transformation. So this can be a very different planet for us to inhabit. So I think there's a place for us to not be mired in this hopelessness, and to remember that hope is available, and there's evidence of it around us if we look. Always, there really is. And I would not have said that like 5 years ago, 4 years ago, when that moment happened. Would not have said that at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and we are each just these individuals in our little bodies. And yet, if each of us are making those little steps forward, there is an effect, a great effect that can take. And I like to think, because I also support people with uncovering trauma and healing and feeling their pain. And I guess anytime I'm holding space for someone and I get to see like they start to crack open and to open in their heart and to feel, and suddenly there's something is lifted and something is open, and that even just that, like, is, that is something that can give me hope, and that there is healing happening. And I think I do see now, and that what is happening in the generationally, and also in the women's entrepreneurship realm that I'm in, and seeing people like, wow, really waking up. And this is a conversation that is coming to the forefront in many ways, more than I have seen before. And and I also want to give space to ask for people that are interested in the book, where can they find it? And I also know you're doing a tour across the country and leading workshops. And I wanted to see if you could tell us a little more about that.
Yes. So the book, Skill in Action, part of it's based on what I've shared and my story, and part of it's based on a teacher training that I lead in North Carolina. I'm about to graduate the fourth cohort from the program. Fourth class. And I really created that program because I wanted the yoga world to be talking about justice in yoga. And I wanted to call people into the action that I speak about in the book, so that it's not just what is happening on the mat and how we're transforming, that we need to do something with that. And so wrote the book, which part of it's similar to the things that I talk about in the teacher training. And again, part of it's just what unfolded as I started to write it. And I wrote it because I want it to be part of teacher trainings all over the country. I do not consider myself a writer. That wasn't what I thought. I just didn't think of myself that way. It really was like, I want this to be part of the conversation. And how can I make a space or create a tool that can be useful in these yoga spaces that so many people go to, right? So many people are practicing yoga. So I want it to be part of teacher trainings. And I want other people who are not going to be in a teacher training to read it. It's really useful for activists and for yogis and for really anyone who's interested in justice and how to create a just world. So the book is available on my website. It's also available through Amazon, and it's also available, I've been searching, because it's available if you just look up Skill in Action in my name, through different book distributors. So it's getting out there, but I know the two places that for sure that people can get it is Amazon and my website, or Amazon and my website. And I am starting a book tour. It's going to start in mid-June. I'm in Portland right now. I will start in Seattle, and then in July, I'll do some stuff around Portland. I'm going to give some Dharma talks, some book readings, lead some workshops. I have a 3 to 4 hour workshop, a day-long workshop, and a weekend workshop option. And then as I've reached out to people, I've ended up, agreeing to do other things like a Dharma talk in different community spaces, so not a yoga studio, which is great. I want to get the word out about this. And so I'll do some stuff in Portland, and then I'm going to San Francisco and Oakland, to Colorado, and to St. Louis, and then I'll land in North Carolina at the Asheville Yoga Festival. I'm teaching with 3 other teachers. We're teaching an immersion, a day-long immersion, as part of that festival about race, and how to use the practice of yoga to create a just world. And after that, I'm sure it's already happening. People are going to be asking me to come and facilitate conversations or lead workshops in their spaces, which I'm very open to doing. A strength of mine is holding a group and a space and creating a container that is safer than the world can feel, again, even just for a moment. And I think it's a unique offering to be talking about mindfulness, justice, and the practice of yoga. And so people can find out about the offerings. So there's the book on the website, but they can find out about the workshop offerings and also anti-racism training that I do on my website. And then there's also intuitive healing that I do individually and with groups, and that's listed on the website as well.
Right. And I'll include the links when we share this so people can find those easily. I wonder if you just have any closing words for us, and then I'll bring us back to the breath to end our time together. But anything you want to leave people with, anything you want people to just take away, closing words.
Yes, in the epilogue of the book, I write about the Bhagavad Gita, which is where skill and action comes from. And when I heard that from the Gita, it was like a moment of waking up, a different layer, a different way of cracking open, because it just felt like truth and medicine is what it felt like, actually. And in the epilogue, I write about the Gita and Arjuna, who was the warrior in the Gita, and Krishna was Arjuna's guide. And I basically say, every one of us is Arjuna right now. Like, so what are we going to do? And how are we going to take action? And at the end of every yoga class or training, whether it's a yoga training or not, I say, may all beings everywhere be happy and free. And may our thoughts, words, and actions contribute to that happiness and freedom for all. And then I add on, may our world be just, and may we all find peace. And so I will offer that to you and to all of the listeners, anyone who gets to hear these words. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Let's just take a moment to feel back into our breath, into our body, to this moment. And to everyone listening, I invite you to just take into your heart any gems, any new information, any wisdom that you are taking with you, any actions that you wish to take to ripple out in the world. And with gratitude, I'll just bring my hands to my heart, thanking each of you listening for showing up, for doing your work in your life. And to Michelle for courageously sharing so open-heartedly and inviting people into these conversations, into the discomfort, into the places where we can be of our highest growth, to create change and to know that we are creating this future together. And so with that, I'll just bow. Any blessings, thanks, gratitude, and namaste. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to our show today. We would love to hear what you think. Take a moment to hop on over to iTunes and leave us a review. We'd be so grateful to receive it. Until next time, namaste.